This program is brought to you by Ignite TV. Now you're in command. Visit Rogers.com for more details.
Hi, and welcome to a Rogers TV special presentation. We're going to be talking about water. And my guest is Andrew Barton, who is a Senior Public Health Manager for Environmental Health at the Grey Bruce Health Unit. Andrew, it's a pleasure to see you again. Good to have you here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Now, just before we started the show, we were talking about water and your portfolio, and I suspect a lot of people don't realize or understand what the water portfolio really involves, because for 90% of the people in this viewing area, you turn on the tap, there's your water, it's pure, it's drinkable, and you jump in the shower and it's fine, and you flush the toilet, goes away, boom. But It's a lot more complex than that, isn't it?
It is more complex, yeah. I think, and I think you're right. We, are lucky that most people in this country take for granted the fact we have good water, and we do, of course, have some of the best source water anywhere in the world. But it's not as simple as that. We don't just take that source water and drink it. The majority of people in Ontario use municipal water. And that's true in Grey Bruce as well, but less true than in most parts of the province, certainly in southern Ontario. Of course, if you're on municipal water, then the hard work is done for you by the municipality, essentially. They obviously, they filter it, they treat it, there's regular testing and so on. Now, for a lot of people in this area, though, we're on private water supplies. Wells of different descriptions, some source water and sand points, those sorts of things as well. And of course, in that case, you're responsible for your own water quality, and that the work entailed, the treatment, if you have treatment, the testing falls on the homeowner. So public health has a role in the regulated systems, in municipal systems, but particularly when it comes to private water systems, we're really the only people out there that can lend a hand and can support the homeowner.
Right. And I know it's not just people who live permanently here, it's also the seasonal population. You mentioned sandpoints. People with cottages, particularly out on the beach, in the beach areas, often have sandpoints because they're easy, they're inexpensive, but they really just draw surface water, don't they?
Yeah, more or less. A couple of different points. Certainly in this area, we do have a lot of year-round residents who are on wells as well, but certainly a lot of the seasonal residents are on wells or private water systems of some kind. And why not get into a little bit of detail, if that's okay?
Sure.
Because there are a number of different wells out there. We have lots of people who are on deep drilled wells. Typically what you will see with those is a sort of 6-inch wide metal casing coming out of the ground. They typically access water fairly deep in the ground, and depending where you are across Grey Bruce, depending on the hydrogeology, different depths, but generally speaking they're quite deep, and typically bringing water to you that is quite good. You may still need to do some treatment, but from a bacteriological, from a safety point of view, typically it's quite good. We then move into the sort of shallower wells, so bored wells, sort of somewhere in the middle ground, and then dug wells, typically fairly shallow.
Yes.
And as you get shallower, you've obviously got less ground, you have less soil, less rock between where the water's coming from and what you're accessing, and they therefore become typically more susceptible to contamination.
Right.
And then you move to a sand point, which is essentially just a very shallow well, as you say, driven into the sand, and then of course ultimately just to a surface water intake where you have literally a pipe taking water in from a lake. And obviously either of those are again more subject to contamination.
Sure. And what kind of contamination would you be looking at? Okay, a deep well is probably, as you said, less susceptible, but for someone who has a sand point or just draws water from the lake, what are the big risks there?
Yeah, so The risks that we talk about most are bacteriological. There are theoretically, potential risks from chemical contamination or radionuclides or, viruses, but those really are pretty unusual. So really we focus on the bacteria. We're going to get to talk a little bit more about well testing later on, but the well testing that we do in Ontario, actually most places that are looking for contaminants in drinking water, are for two different indicator organisms. So we look for total coliform and we look for E. coli. Both bacteria, and the reason they're called indicator organisms is because they give us a really good indication of whether there's a problem or not. Total coliform, very, very widespread. You'll find them in undergrowth, in leaf mulch. They come from insects, all that kind of thing. If you have that in your drinking water, it indicates that something's not quite right. Shouldn't really be there. If you have E. coli in your drinking water, that's an indication of potentially quite a serious problem. E. coli only comes from the guts of warm-blooded animals. So without getting into too much detail, we're talking about fecal contamination of some kind.
And that's what happened at Walkerton.
Correct.
That's exactly the situation that happened at Walkerton. And let's face it was cows.
Yes. Can be cows, can be from humans,
Sure.
Can be all sorts of different sources. None of them good news.
Yeah.
Now, not all E. coli will have the same sort of fairly catastrophic impacts that unfortunate event did, but there is the potential there, and that's why the sort of acceptable limit for E. coli is it needs to be 0. If you have any in there, that's not a good thing.
Right. And the other thing is that there are regulations about things like distances from wells to septics and wells to holding tanks, and it's more than just calling in a well driller and drilling a well and saying, drill here. Oh, no. It's a little more complex than that.
It is more complex, yeah. So really it does start with, perhaps if it's a new build, planning where things are going to go, and obviously with small lots that can be a little bit challenging. You're quite right, there are setback distances in the building code, so that's looked after by the municipalities. New wells, again in Ontario, they are regulated. They're looked after by the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, MECP, and they have a regulation that dictates essentially how they're constructed. So if all goes according to plan, when you buy or get your new home, those setback distances should be good. The well should have been constructed to the correct standards. So really then we're into maintenance of the well, maintenance of the septic system if you have one, and really sort of just keeping an eye on the quality of that water. Of course, I've been in this situation myself. Lots of us in Grey Bruce potentially have a more old property with fairly old infrastructure, in which case lots of things can have happened in the 50 years or so since that well was developed.
Well, I think most people have heard the stories of they go digging for their septic system because something's wrong, and oh my goodness, it's worse than we thought, and they are replacing the whole system. But the worst cases I've heard of was, yeah, the septic system is an old 50-gallon drum. No, that's not legal anymore.
Yes, I mean, anecdotally, I've heard some stories as well. Obviously, septics going wrong can impact on the wells, but there are definitely other sources as well. And I think, there are some things that you can do as a well owner or as the tenant of somewhere that uses well water to sort of visually inspect just very easily. And then, of course, there is testing as well.
Right. Now, for example, if your well smells of rotten eggs, that means you got sulfur.
Most likely. Yeah.
And that's treatable. But it's not. But it's a taste thing. It's not, or a smell thing. It's not a bacteriological thing. Right.
So there are all sorts of things that you can find with well water that aren't necessarily going to impact on the safety, but would be in some cases objectionable, or at least certainly noticeable. So sulfur smells are one that's fairly common. Contamination by either iron or iron bacteria, where you get that discoloration, is quite common as well. And you know, those things, you may, as a homeowner, you may decide that you want to treat for those things. For, you know, everything from how pleasant the drinking water is through to the longevity of your dishwasher and many other things in between.
Very true, because when you start talking about things like iron and sulfur, it can have a corrosive effect on the parts of your dishwasher, your washing machine, even your sink.
You can certainly notice the difference. Now, I will say that, you know, in public health, we don't get too much into those things. I absolutely understand why people may want to treat for them, but we typically really stick more to those sort of main safety issues, so bacteria in particular.
But let's be clear, there are commercial firms in the community that will be glad to answer your questions about your water quality, not the bacteriological stuff. Well, that they obviously will do things to help that, but you don't resolve any of those issues. That's something.
Yeah, correct. So you're absolutely right. There are a number of businesses in the area that can help the homeowner design a system to treat whatever their problem may be. You know, it might be aesthetics, or it might be that they are getting adverse samples, and you know, there are ways, really just in very much the same way that municipal systems are designed, you can have a scaled down version of that in your home. Obviously there is a cost associated with buying it and with operating it. So it's you know, there is a cost, but almost anything is achievable really to resolve those water issues.
Sure. Now, one of the things that you do is that you facilitate the testing of water for bacteriological contamination. And that's the big issue these days, because obviously in our minds here in Grey Bruce, it's Walkerton that has brought it to the front, but it's the health unit that manages that program, isn't it?
It is, yeah, and I should really sort of acknowledge and shout out here that Public Health Ontario, so they run the public health labs across the province. The one for our region is based out of London. And obviously they do the actual testing of the water, and I think it's worth mentioning that, because sometimes people assume that we do that locally, and we don't. The water samples taken locally are essentially couriered down to the lab and tested, and then the homeowner obviously can phone in and will be sent the results. So our role in that is somewhat in facilitating that ability to drop the samples off, and it's also in interpreting and helping people understand what those results mean and how they can move forward from that.
Sure. So it would be fair to say the public health is kind of the person in the middle.
Yeah, I think that's probably fair. I mean, obviously we have a relationship with Public Health Ontario, course, yes. So we sort of work through that. And I think, you know, one of the things we'll perhaps get into a little bit is the before and after the pandemic, in terms of what that looks like and that sort of drop off.
We'll get there, believe me.
Yes,
because I remember that you know, pre-pandemic, it was, you got these little bottles and you did it in a certain way, and you know, but things have changed, as we will get to. Mm-hmm. But let's talk a little bit about the let's say the average homeowner who's on a well or a private system of some kind. They have to do water testing. How often should they be doing that kind of testing?
Great question. So we advise that, and I'm going to make an assumption here, you know, that somebody does a little bit of sampling, they find that their system is either providing good water as is, or they put some filtration disinfection in place, and everything's working. So at that point, we would recommend ideally doing it 3 times a year, even twice, not too bad. The reason we say more than once is because it's really good to hit some different seasons. There are different stresses on a water system at different times of the year. So you can imagine in the early spring, you know, you've got that snow melt, you've maybe got a lot of rain coming down, everything's wet and soggy. the risk of contamination from the surface is probably at its highest. If you've got some source of, well, back to that fecal contamination, somewhat close to the well, then everything's fairly mobile, and it may be that it's finding its way in there. So great time to test that sort of, March, April, maybe into May, that sort of period of time. Conversely, when you get to late summer, depending on what sort of system you have, everything's getting quite dry, the water may be starting to be drawn down a little bit, and that can potentially highlight other problems in a water system. So definitely a good idea to look at another sample, perhaps in that, August sort of period, late July through to early September.
Labor Day.
Sure, why not?
Yeah.
Although maybe not everybody do it on the same day.
We'll get to that issue in a few minutes, but yeah, you're right. But somewhere around Labor Day.
Somewhere around there, yeah. And certainly, throwing a third one in the middle of winter is certainly not a bad idea. And the idea is to sort of try to have a system that you sort of regularly do it. I mean, say regularly, it doesn't need to be every week, assuming the system's all working good, but it's just enough to evaluate, to do,
Sure.
to do what would happen in a regulated system, less frequently, but so that you've got some data, that everything's working.
Yeah, I was just thinking, just the way my mind works, if we use Labor Day as one rough benchmark, you could do it around Christmas and then Easter.
Sure.
Those would be three good seasonal marks. Now Easter, because it moves, it can do something else with that. But the point is, 3 times a year, Christmas, Easter, Labor Day, you're done.
Yeah.
And more frequently if you need to.
Yeah, so that's a good follow-up as well, because obviously if you do get some sort of issue, then I encourage people to reach out. We have a helpline, so there's a public health inspector available every day throughout the week, those are 5 days a week, to answer a variety of queries, but certainly private drinking water is one of the main things that they will talk to people about. We can give advice about what that result means. We can give some pointers perhaps as to what the next move might be, but certainly one of the next things would be to do a resample. Particularly where people they don't have any E. coli, but they have some total coliform. Okay, so something's not quite right. One of the things that can be is just contamination of the bottle or contamination around the tap when you take the sample. So, no need to panic at that stage. It's just a good idea perhaps to do a resample, just make sure everything has been done correctly. It's very, very easy to contaminate and get those low counts of total coliform.
Reminds me, the advice we gave you during COVID: wash your hands, wash your hands, wash your hands. Remember what your mother said: wash your hands. Holds true for water samples.
Absolutely, it does, and definitely, just that little brush of the finger inside the bottle. Definitely, if that tap has a little bit of contamination and hasn't been sort of cleaned or disinfected off, then certainly possible. And if for some reason you grab a water sample from an outside tap, which is never a good idea, the risk of contamination from insects or something, it means it's almost likely that you would see a bit of total coliform.
Well, let's talk a bit about the testing itself, because that's probably worth mentioning. Where do you get the test bottles? These bottles?
Yeah,
you don't carry them in your hip pocket, do you?
No. Well, you could probably fit one in your pocket. But yeah, you can pick them up. Basically, most of the places where you can drop the samples off, you then be able to pick the bottles up.
And we've got that on the screen right now. So.
Oh, perfect. There we go. Yeah. So they're not a huge bottle. We actually do have a video that you can access from our website that shows how to fill them correctly. You can see there the barcodes which need to go on the sample form itself. A little bit of information about the address and a few other things. So the process is not complex, but you definitely have to kind of work your way through those stages. So yeah, those bottles are available at the drop-off locations. The health unit's always a good bet as well, of course. I will note that again, we don't obviously make these. These bottles come through the Public Health Ontario system. And again, in the summer, they can be a challenge for us to keep ahead of. We get through a lot in this area, and you know, those boxes get emptied pretty quickly.
Sure. So the idea, we'll talk about timing in a minute, but I think the idea is if you need one, and it's okay, don't be assuming you're going to get a second one if you go back in a week's time.
Yeah, I mean, ideally you would be able to pick them up and it wouldn't be a problem, but I have to acknowledge that occasionally that is a challenge.
And we'll put out an apology right now.
We can do that. We can do that, yeah. So certainly we're already into the time of year where we're sort of pushing to get as many boxes delivered as we can. We don't always get the full amount fulfilled, so we just keep pushing and just trying to get as many through as we can.
And then you fill out the form.
Yep.
It's attached to the bottle. It's in the plastic envelope. And then do what?
So yeah, essentially, I mean, maybe I should spend just a few seconds to run through. So when you come to decide to take the sample, you really do want an indoor tap, ideally one that you use for drinking. Kitchen tap makes the most sense. The tap, if possible, you should remove the screen, because the screen can have a little bit of debris and things in there, and clean that off, and ideally disinfect it as well. Like a little alcohol wipe is a good idea.
Sure.
And then you set that.
Javex?
You can. You have to be a little bit careful though with using any sort of bleach, and that's that we don't want you to get a false negative.
Right.
And we don't really want that bleach kind of disinfecting that water. Obviously you wouldn't normally have the benefit of that disinfection. So a little alcohol wipe's probably safer.
Right.
Although I do know some people use bleach and it can be done okay.
Yeah.
So then the tap should be just set to run for a little while, just to sort of flush everything through, make sure that you're getting a true test of the water and not of the tap, essentially.
Right.
And then, as we talked about a little bit, that careful removal of the top, filling to the fill mark, and putting the top back on without touching anything inside. And yes, filling out the form and all that stuff. Little tip, probably best to take the barcode off and put it on the form before you fill the bottle, because otherwise it gets wet and everything gets hard to deal with.
Right,
Yeah.
Sure.
So yes, you've got your bottle now. The form, once filled out, goes back in the sort of plastic bag and gets attached to the bottle with a elastic band. Ideally, you go through this whole process and get it to the drop-off point, reasonably quickly. If you can't do it reasonably quickly, then get it in the fridge after you've sampled it. It won't be tested by the lab if there's been a delay of more than 48 hours. And 48 hours sounds like a long time. But the reality is, if you're dropping off, particularly in the afternoon, it's going to sit in the drop-off fridge until the next day's courier. So depending where you are in Grey Bruce, the courier will pick that up anywhere from about 8 in the morning to early afternoon. And then it's got to get back down to London. So they won't start analysis until probably about 5 p.m. that day. So you can imagine you're losing a day even before anything else. So that's why we advise people, if possible, to take it, and get it to the drop-off point reasonably sort of quickly.
Yeah, and morning is probably best if you're going to, like, if you take the empty bottle, but do your sample in the morning and take it as quickly as possible to make that drop-off connection or the pickup connection.
Yeah, if you know where you're taking it and when the courier gets there, it's ideal to get there before the courier. Yeah.
Obviously, yeah. Now this gets into another issue that we'll be talking about a little later, but there are a number of drop-off spots across Grey Bruce in public locations, often food stores.
Yeah, so I mean, we're talking about the changes during the pandemic here, really.
Right.
So for a number of years in Grey Bruce, the drop-off locations were the hospitals across the region. And we were a little bit unusual from a provincial point of view in doing that. But there was good logic to it. So the courier doesn't just pick up water samples, they pick up the various different tests from the hospitals. And I should note at this point that that not only is Grey Bruce quite a large area, but the courier also picks up from Huron and Perth on the same run.
Yeah,
so this is a long run that they do to get to and from London. So it sort of made sense to piggyback on where the courier was already going. But as we know, we got into the pandemic and we started to really, as a society, take a closer look at infection control practices. And one of the things that we were encouraged, that's loud.
It is, but that's okay.
Okay.
It's not. They're not coming through the roof. I don't know if you can hear that. They're doing some work on the roof here at Rogers TV. But we'll just talk right through that.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that we were trying to do was to avoid extra visits to the hospital.
Sure.
So as one of the early pandemic response things, we had some wonderful partners, really, in that 3 different grocery stores stepped forward. They were essentially about one of the only places open at that time.
True, very true.
And of course, purchasing food was necessary, and we felt that still being able to drop off water samples was also necessary. So it sort of went together quite well. So we were able to replace 3 of the hospital locations with these 3 grocery stores. We of course continued to have the location at our own offices as well.
Sure.
So it was a reduced service in terms of the number of drop-off locations, but we still had them somewhat spread across the region. And that, I think, was a fair response at the time. Obviously, as we came out of the pandemic, we started to look as to, okay, well, how can we sort of get back to a system where we had more drop-off locations? And that's been, that's taken a little bit more time than ideal, I think it's fair to say.
Yeah. And the thing is, there's a lot of moving pieces here too, because what we take for granted is a sample gets picked up, taken to the lab tests it, and we get the results mailed to us?
Yeah, mailed, but there's also a process where you can phone in and you essentially use the barcode so you can get to that information a bit more quickly.
Right. There's no online service. You can't check a portal to see if they haven't moved that far ahead yet.
So there is a portal. It's been varied as to how you can get that information out. I'm not quite sure whether that's truly up and running at the moment, but
or as they say, it's still being tested.
Still being tested, yes.
Well, I have to say that the other portals do seem to work reasonably well. So let's hope they get this one up and running, because so many people would love to get their results either by email or through being able to check.
Yeah, the phone thing's good, but you don't then obviously have any kind of written confirmation.
Right.
So, and one of the reasons people will test water is to do with house sales and things.
Well, I was going to say that if someone sometimes a condition of sale is a safe well test, so that maybe you want to have that quickly, and you want to have that written in order to get the conditions satisfied.
Yeah, obviously, if you're selling a home, you could take samples, elect to have them sent to you, which takes a little bit more time, but then you'd actually have them there.
Yeah.
So that's an option. Obviously, if you're buying, depending on how long you've got, you may not have the luxury of enough time to get it sent. So you might be relying on that other system.
Well, I gathered that Public Health Ontario kind of threw a little wrench into the works, or as my machine shop teacher used to say, "Spanner in the works, boys, spanner in the works."
Well, it's one of the reasons it's taken a little bit of time is trying to work out what challenges other people have, not just ourselves. And I don't think we really understood quite how tight a deadline PHO had with that courier of theirs. We were hoping to add more locations, and had actually already reached out to municipalities to sort of try and allocate new municipal public spaces that we could have a water drop-off point, which we thought was a good idea. The municipalities generally were very much on board with. It fits very well with their remit and their services to the residents as well. The challenge was the Public Health Ontario and through their courier just don't have the capacity. And I think it took several conversations before we really understood quite how difficult, even now in fact, their route is. As I say, they're picking up from hospitals as well, so they have multiple drop-off pickup points right the way around that route. They also have to then run some of those samples to the lab in Toronto after they've dropped off at London. So the entire process, which obviously is a daily process, 5 days a week anyway, it already is taking them, I think, in the order of 12 or 13 hours. That may not even include the run down to Toronto. Mm-hmm. So, we're trying to squeeze, I don't know, what's the expression? We're trying to get a gallon into a pint pot or something.
Exactly, yes, that's exactly what I was thinking.
Yeah. So I think once we understood what that challenge was, that led us into a slightly different direction, really. So we knew that we were, from the feedback we've got from all sorts of people, we knew we were on the right lines by trying to have more locations. The convenience of only perhaps having to drive 20 minutes rather than in some cases maybe an hour to get to a drop-off location. It's not even just a convenience thing. It's an access equity issue as well.
Sure.
And I was always concerned that was going to have be the potential of creating a barrier for people to do testing as well.
Right.
So we knew we were on the right lines, but the question was, well, how to fit these two separate concepts together. So what we're doing now is we're developing a network with our municipalities. So there will be a number of different drop-off locations throughout Grey and Bruce, actually more locations than we had prior to the pandemic. And we will have a third party, essentially our own courier, that does those, picks up those bottles, does a route round, and then essentially coordinates with the PHO courier to get those samples down to London.
Sure. So it's you basically had to go back to square one and redesign the system, because what was in place wasn't going to continue, and yet this was a necessary service, essential service, if you want to call it that.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, I think we had the ability was sort of diminishing, but the need was, if anything, increasing, and certainly the desire. Mm-hmm. And that becomes quite a tricky problem. To something that on the surface seems so easy. I just want to put my samples
put my bottle in the
and
fridge and send me the results when they're ready.
Yeah.
But as I've often said, if you look behind the screen, what you see is a whole lot more complex than it was. And I must say, I recall back, we're now in mid-June, but I remember back in the winter that there was conversation with municipalities about this service, and they were gung-ho. They were, hey, we want to do this. This is very exciting stuff. We want to support our ratepayers, and because we know people need this water testing service. Absolutely.
So we had some great response from the municipalities. And I will say, initially when I reached out to them, we were still working on Plan A, and thought that we'd be able to have the PHO courier go to those locations. So that side has changed, but what hasn't changed is the support from the municipalities, and I think they understand the benefit, as I say, to their residents as well as for the public health side of things.
Sure, it's almost like a problem that is, you discover, is like most problems, far more complex than you originally envisioned. I bet you this did not where you are is not where you thought you'd be.
No, I think honestly, my background is not in logistics and couriers and that kind of thing, and talking to the lab manager at PHO, and we can have a great conversation looking at the results of water testing or whatever else it might be, but there was a gap, I think, there in terms of understanding the logistics of just physically how to get things there.
There is a way of thinking, and I recall receiving some both positive and negative feedback about it, that here in Grey Bruce we look to local solutions for local problems. Is this a good example of that kind of thing where the health unit developed a local solution for a local problem?
I think that is fair, yeah. I think, I don't want to say we are unique in having this problem, but certainly, further south of us, generally speaking, you're going to be closer to a lab or closer to an existing drop-off point. In the true north, yes, they have vast distances, but generally they do have a lab in those main population centres. So, St Maryth and the Bay, whatever, they'll have a lab there. So we're sort of between those two extremes, and that's certainly not unique to us, but definitely well represented in this area. The solution that we have come up with is, I believe, unique. And yes, it wasn't our original plan, but I think it is going to allow us to serve the population of grey Bruce quite well, and we'll see what happens. Who knows? Maybe it'll roll out across the rest of the province.
That wouldn't be the first time that's happened, where we've done stuff in grey Bruce that the province has picked up because grey Bruce is an exemplar, or that we just thought a little differently and worked the solution out for other people.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, here's a question, and I have certain politicians in my mind's eye right now who are going to ask this question. So who's going to pay for all this?
Well, we have had the confirmation, I guess, verbal confirmation at least at this point, that it is going to be paid for by the province, so it won't be locally paid for. So we'll certainly keep pursuing that.
And I know our local politicians from other shows that I've done and my conversations with them, they are very effective at making those points with our local politicians, or our provincial politicians.
Good.
So we'll see what happens. I can just imagine this. I can just imagine this being a part of a deputation at either AMO or Roma.
I think, to be fair to the folks at the province, they are a partner in this as well, and they want to make it work. They want to make it work for us, and at the end of the day, there's only so many hours in a day, and if it wasn't going to work the other way, well, maybe we can make this work.
Yeah, because after all, safe drinking water is an absolute essential, and for all of Ontario, all the people of Ontario, to have safe drinking water. And so if the province can be a partner in this, making safe drinking water safer here in Grey Bruce, it's also their responsibility, not just the county and local municipalities.
Sure, absolutely. And, I think they understand that, and I think, the other part of this is the number of people on private systems. So, there are not just municipalities, there are health units that perhaps have no more than 1% of their population on private water systems, whereas for us, although it's a minority, it's actually not that much of a minority. I think we're around about 40% or something like that. The number of tests as well, I know that so 2019, the last full year before the pandemic, people in Grey Bruce put in more than 12,000 samples that year, which is an order of magnitude more than some health units have. So it was not just an important, but also a very well-used service.
Right. Well, I think that I hate to bring up it again, but Walkerton has made people aware that they have to monitor the quality of their water, because they are responsible. I mean, although I live in the city of Owen Sound, I accept the fact that my city is responsible for that, and I pay taxes for that. But if you live out in the country, or you have a summer vacation home or cottage, you've got to take responsibility for it. So I think people are much more aware. Yeah,
I think it's a hard one to have sort of real numbers or real evidence on, but I suspect you're right. We certainly have large numbers of them, but there is quite a lot of people out there with quite good knowledge about this as well, and when our staff receive calls, certainly some of those calls, somebody needs help in identifying where the well is, what type of well they have. They're starting from scratch. But conversely, we have quite a lot of people that call already with a lot of knowledge, and they're looking to just sort of reconfirm that if they take a certain process, if I do this with my ultraviolet and I flush and do this, is that going to be good enough? Is that going to help?
Yeah.
And I think, to me, those conversations show that there is quite a lot of knowledge out there.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because for my part of my work, I did some reading, and I came across an excellent handbook on water systems that the province produces. It's a small drinking water system handbook or something like that. But it talks about the different types of wells, the regulations, what you have to do, and it's incredibly easy to understand. And it's part of being, if you have those systems, it's part of being a responsible homeowner, just to have that knowledge. And sounds like a lot of people do.
Yeah, so the resources are definitely out there. The small drinking water systems are one of the types of regulated systems. So those are the small regulated systems that again, the Healthy and Public Health, we regulate those. But because they're small systems, some of that information is actually quite helpful for the homeowner. Grey Bruce Public Health has also got a booklet that we produce specifically for the homeowner. So it's that similar sort of information, but sort of really aimed purely at the homeowner. And we're kind of old school. We still have physical brochures if people want that. The information is also on the website, so it is available. Yeah.
And I have to say that the website is incredibly comprehensive, and don't be intimidated when you look at it first time. You think, where is this stuff? Just use the search function at the top, and it'll show up. I've done it a lot of times, so it does work.
Yes, yeah,
it does work.
Yeah.
But the other thing about these small drinking, or these homeowners' drinking water systems, is that if you have a well, in theory, it should be registered. In theory.
It should be. And a little bit outside my wheelhouse here, in that we as an organisation don't do that.
No, that's a provincial responsibility or municipal responsibility.
But part of that regulation is the registration. It will likely have a little tag, a well tag. Certainly, if it's a new one, it should still be there. There is also a website that you can access, a provincial website, that shows you a map, and you can sort of go in and all of those registered wells, there's limited data, but there's some data on there.
Well, we can tell you how deep it is.
It does.
And that's really interesting, because I was in a conversation with some people, and we were talking about wells. I have weird conversations, trust me. But I was able to, they were just saying, well, it's so and such deep. And yeah, it is. That's so you have an idea that how deep those wells are, and some of them, like you said, are very deep, 200, 250 feet.
Yeah, certainly some are. It will also give you some data on the materials drilled through. So obviously there's different types of rock and shale and things that they'll go through. The whole area is the hydrogeology, or the geology, is kind of on a slant there. So
it is.
It's kind of interesting that maybe what you hit 20 feet down near Owen Sound is what you're hitting 100 feet down as you get towards the Huron coastline, kind of thing. So that's interesting. And then it will also note where they hit water, and also there will be a test done at the time as to the yield rate, so how much water. So there's helpful information there for sure. Yeah, sure.
And that doesn't. But actually, this leads back to another question I had: is what are the methods of disinfection or purification of water that you see in home systems? Is there any particular type that, or are there just a bunch of types that you can choose from?
So there's a few different types. So what we're talking here is particularly systems, and we can probably have a little bit of a chat afterwards about sort of the emergency provisions you might want to do if you have a problem. But for permanent systems, probably the most popular is a physical filter or a couple of physical filters, and then an ultraviolet light, UV. UV is really good, very effective. Obviously, we're talking essentially about the same UV light as you might have from sunlight, but this is, in a controlled situation because it's a bulb, puts out sufficient energy to kill any bacteria that are in there, and does so with a relatively low energy use. So, I mean, the cost of running it is not particularly high. That will essentially solve bacteriological problems. Now, you do need the pre-filtration because the one problem with UV is that, well, it's light, and if you have turbid water, so water that's discolored, then the bacteria can essentially sort of hide amongst those little particles and not have sufficient energy of light hit it to actually deactivate them. So those pre-filters are really an important, integral part of a UV system. So that's the most common, relatively, I hesitate to say this about anything these days, but relatively inexpensive and effective for sort of those basic problems. Some people will elect to go with something like a reverse osmosis system, also effective, but they can't flow as much water through them, so they're more typically a way of treating sort of a single source, a single tap. And you will also see people, and we talked a little bit about aesthetics earlier on, and some people have water that's a little bit more difficult to deal with, organics and other things. So they may well have water softeners, they may well have, sort of multiple other things, and we're getting away a little bit from water safety there.
Yeah, iron, aesthetic things like iron filters and sulfur filters and those things. But that's sort of part of the system, but that's not that doesn't deal with purification.
No, and we would always say, if you go in that route, definitely have some form of disinfection, like UV or something similar at the end of the treatment train to make sure that it's safe as well.
Sure. Do you find that, are there individual chlorination systems that are used, or are they pretty much used for small drinking water systems and municipal systems?
Yeah, chlorine is, or hypochlorite is really effective at killing bacteria. It is also quite expensive to install the system, requires more maintenance, requires more upkeep. So generally speaking, we don't see a lot of private homes going with chlorine. The big advantage of chlorine is compared to UV. So UV will do a great job at killing things at that one time and place. But if you then have water in a large distribution system, going to multiple different homes or cabins or whatever else, there's nothing protecting it from then on.
Right.
The chlorine's not like that because you'll have a residual chlorine, so it will continue to be protected in the distribution system, which is exactly why that's what they use in municipal systems. So for most homes, that's not really relevant because you're just talking about a single house and a treatment system treating that one home. I guess if you had some sort of camp or a complex arrangement, then it could be something you could start thinking about.
Sure.
But that would be quite unusual.
Now, you alluded earlier to what if things break down? What if you have to shut your system off for some reason? What do you do? Obviously, you call your plumber. That's number one.
You can, and certainly also, shout out for the public health inspectors. Give them a call, because if you're just looking at those results, you're looking at the water, you're thinking, oh man, I don't know what to do with this. Then that's a good call to make. There's a number of things. So if you have a treatment system, you can certainly go back to look, well, why isn't that doing its job?
Right.
You can actually go back even sort of further, and I would always recommend people physically inspect the well, because things can change. You maybe the ground's dried up, there's cracks appeared, somebody's knocked the cap off, or it could be something quite simple that's allowing those problems. So definitely worth starting right back at the well and working your way up. Assuming that you've identified some problems, you've made some changes, you also are going to want to make sure that the system itself is safe, and that's where bleach does come in. hypochlorite. There's resources that you can link to from our website that would tell you how much to use. And what we're talking about here is essentially getting chlorine into the whole system, letting it sit for a while, letting it run out, and then returning back to use.
Right.
Well, doing a resample first, but the aim is to return back to use. Obviously, that's not a true chlorine system. It's a sort of one-off process, but doing that will not only kill bacteria that are in the water, but it'll also help to disinfect the inside of all of those pipes and everything else. So it's a useful part of resolving a problem, but not the only part.
Sure.
Obviously, we need to actually get to the bottom of what caused the problem in the first place.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's where your plumber can help, and a public health inspector if there's issues that you need to address.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. It's I think I go back to what I said at the very beginning. It's a lot more complex than we ever imagined.
Yeah. I mean, I know no one likes paying their water bill, but the folks that look after our municipal systems do a lot of work, and
They do.
Obviously that helps ensure a safe supply, and when you don't have those people doing that, then you're sort of taking on some of that role yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, one question I also wanted to come back to, and I didn't ask you earlier, was this new system of drop off and pick up is not yet in place. So the old system, which is there's a page on the public health website,
Correct.
That outlines the drop-off points, and there's problems because it's not equalized across the region. For example, if you're at Sauble Beach, you can either go to Wyerton or to here in Owen Sound, where you used to be able to go to Southampton. But the new system, which will have more drop-off points, when will that be started? When do you expect to have that operational?
So we're saying certainly summer.
Mm-hmm.
I appreciate that's not an exact answer. There's still a few things to get tied up. But we hope to be fully running with the new system in the region of maybe a dozen different drop-off locations this summer.
And additional locations may be added after that?
Possibly. We'll see. I'd like to hit the ground running with as many as possible to start off with, because I think it'll help us evaluate, more accurately. But we'll certainly be re-adding some of the ones that we had prior to the pandemic. And then actually we are looking to add a few that we didn't have even before the pandemic as well, to try and, I guess, fill some of those gaps.
Yes, because I know that for example, as I mentioned, Sauble Beach, you've either got to take it to Wyerton or Owen Sound because you can't go to drop it off at the Southampton Hospital anymore. So we'll just have to wait and see what different drop-off points will. I'm sure that there'll be something in Saugeen Shores.
Yeah, there will be for sure, and that's certainly one of the significant gaps. There are one or two other gaps at the moment. I mean, essentially the drop-off locations currently are Kincardine, Wyerton, Owen Sound and Markdale. So there's obviously fairly large gaps around of those.
Sure.
We do also, and this is thanks to Municipality of North Bruce Peninsula, we do have a drop-off location that's up on the North Bruce Peninsula as well. So that's up and running.
Right.
But yes, we'll certainly be adding enough. Now, of course, we can't promise they'll be in every community. That's just not feasible, but certainly access to them, it will be a lot closer to home.
Is there a benchmark you're looking for, like a certain number of minutes for people? Let's use ambulances as an example. Ambulances have a response standard by which they try to reach, and most of the time they do. Do you expect to have access to the drop-off points within a 45-minute drive, 30-minute drive, whatever?
Yeah, so I mean, there's no sort of formal process for that, but certainly we were looking to make sure that a one-way drive would be no more than 30 minutes, and actually in most cases it will now be quite a lot less than that. And I mean, essentially, I'm not sure how high-tech an approach this was, but we had a map and we were sort of looking at where are they right now, and where else can we put the pin in the map to sort of fill those gaps. And then obviously had the conversations with those municipalities.
One thing I also wanted to mention is that this service is also available to cottagers and residents on Saugeen First Nation, because although that's federal land, you have a working agreement, you have working arrangements with the band so that cottagers who are there can have their water tested as part of this service as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other sort of a similar question, we get asked about, home ownership and tenants, and that none of that matters. It's, if you're using that water supply as your water supply, as your drinking water, then you can test it.
Right.
So you're not limited if it's a certain type of well, or if you're a tenant, or if you're living, doesn't matter.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. The issue is safe water.
Yeah.
Not who's responsible.
Absolutely, and I think our goal, is at least our part of this. We want to ensure safe water for everyone.
Yeah, yeah. And do you find that people in Grey Bruce are a little more sensitized to the safe water issue?
It's a difficult one for me to answer.
It's purely subjective, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think that, certainly that's possible, and certainly as we spoke back a little bit before, I think there's a level of awareness that's maybe a little bit higher than some other areas. Certainly having worked in public health in the UK many years ago, prior to Walkerton, actually, prior to that situation, the awareness of private water there was quite a lot less. Far few people on wells, but it was one of the interesting things when I came to Canada that there seemed to, and again this was sort of right around that time, but there seemed to be just a lot more awareness of the issue.
Interesting. Maybe public health has done a good job of communicating the clean water needs over the years.
Oh, well, I'd like to think so. Yes. Can we claim that one?
Hey, why not? I mean, I remember Dr. Lynn saying that clean drinking water is one of the public health successes that we've had in not just in Canada but globally, to bring clean drinking water to people. And obviously, if you have clean water, your health quality improves.
It is one of those truly foundational pieces that we rely on, I think, and it's the situation globally is getting better, but there's still many parts of the world where people just don't have access to clean drinking water. So yeah, very true, very true. I remember a conversation with Mayor Ian Boddy saying that he went to Chicago and toured a water treatment plant in Chicago, and he thought, my golly, this is just a larger version that we've got in Owen Sound. Yeah. So, anyway, thank you so much for being a part of this conversation, Andrew. It's been excellent to talk with you and to get more information about our water system. It's essential for life. It's essential for living, and we know public health has a real role to play. So, thank you. And thank you, friends, for being a part of this Rogers TV special presentation. My guest has been Andrew Barton, who is Senior Public Health Manager for Environmental Health. I'm David Shearman, and yes, we'll see you again.
Call the Rogers TV viewer response line, email us, or connect with us on social media.
I literally saved the world.
Thank you, Spider-Man.
You're an Avenger. Have I killed you before? Batman.
He's a monster who thinks he's a god.
Everything you call a life, I will burn out of time.
Oh, we're all gonna